Hi everyone! Even though I'm wearing a different shirt today, my name is still Brooke and I still work for Sound Salmon Solutions and I am still the Hatchery Program Manager. So before we release these salmon, I think it's very important that we understand what is going on in the creek for our salmon to make sure that it's a healthy environment. And what I want to focus on today is their food source, known as macroinvertebrates. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take a sample of some of the macroinvertebrates that are in Willow Creek, and we're going to go ahead and look through them. But before that, I said this big word a few times now, macroinvertebrates, and I think it's important that we understand what exactly that word means. So we're going to go ahead and break it down. Now, underlined in green right here, I have macro. Now, when I think of macro, I think of the opposite. It must mean the opposite of micro, and micro has to do with something really tiny, and you would need to use a microscope, most likely, to see it, meaning you would need some assistance. Macro is the opposite of that, and it means you can see these bugs with the naked eye. We should not need assistance. We can use some magnification to look at it, but we don't need to. Now, invertebrate, that one's a little bit trickier. I don't know if all of you know this, but humans, all of us that are watching this video and me who is making this video, are vertebrates. And vertebrates simply mean that you have a spine. So if everyone wants to take their hand, touch their back, you are now identifying that you are a vertebrate species. So what this means, invertebrate, means there is a lack of spine and these bugs don't have them. So we are going to be looking at aquatic larvae today. We are going to be looking at all different kinds. Aquatic larvae don't mean just one type of species or they all look the same. We're going to look at a bunch of different kinds of species today. So first, I'm going to go ahead and show you how these bugs are collected. And no, this does neither the bugs nor the environment any harm. And at the end of this video, all of the macros will be returned to the creek. All right. So now I'm going to use this D-frame kick net with a super fine mesh in it to collect the bugs out of Willow Creek. So what I'm going to do is I am going to use my rubber boots and I'm going to kick across the surface and I'm going to try and get those bugs to unlatch themselves from the rocks and to kind of get them all churned up. They're going to end up going into my net and then we will get to catch them and look at them. Here we have a picture of the key to water quality bioassessment using macroinvertebrates. So this is the key that we will use today, and this key tells us that based on which macroinvertebrates we find, it tells us how tolerant they are to pollution. Now by tolerant, we mean that they can stand it or they cannot stand pollution. So if we find a bug, let's say we find a leech, that belongs to group 3, which means it's tolerant to pollution. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing when we're looking at the water quality because it's in the red group, which insinuates if we find multiple bugs from this group, that will tell us that we have poor water quality. If we move on to the yellow group, which is partially tolerant to pollution, they can handle a little bit of pollution, but not too much. So let's say we find a dragonfly nymph. That would be telling us, if we find multiple, that we have fair water quality. Last, if you look at group 1, or the green group, they are intolerant to pollution. So if we find a bunch of those bugs, let's say we find a bunch of the planariums or the flatworms, that tells us that we have really good water quality in Willow Creek. Now, if we find a combination of group 1, 2, and 3, that's also going to be good news for us because that's telling us that we have maybe a little bit of pollution, but not enough that somebody in group 1, let's say we find a planarium, they can still live there. So if we're finding a bunch of variation, that's a good sign. So here's how we sort the bugs. We dump the bucket from what we collected in the creek into 2 clear bins. Now, once we dump them in, it needs to take time to settle, which is totally fine. We wait for about 2 minutes. Once all the water settles, we have what we're looking at right now. And basically what I do is I watch for movement. Once I can see some movement, I can then use a turkey baster, which you can see right here. Those are some of my tools, a turkey baster and a net. And we go ahead and scoop them up by suctioning them up into the turkey baster. It's a very scientific tool. And we sort them into the associated bins. Our first macroinvertebrate is the black fly larva. I can tell this because one of its descriptive characteristics is that it tends to stick to hard surfaces and has a suctioning, wider bottom to it. This macroinvertebrate belongs to the tolerant to pollution group. Here we have aquatic worms. Now they look quite a bit like an earthworm, but the difference is that these ones live in the water. They have a moderate pollution tolerance, or else they fall in the middle yellow category. Here we have the mayfly nymph. Now there are multiple sizes of mayflies in the bucket here. The larger one that's kind of in the middle of the screen is just a little bit more developed than the smaller ones, but they are all mayfly nymphs. And I can tell that because mayflies have 3 tails. They have gill flaps or gill platelets on their torso, which are the little flaps that are sticking out on the midsection of the macroinvertebrate. And they have 2 antennas. These ones belong to the intolerant to pollution group, which is the good water quality group. Last, we have the crane fly larva. Now I can tell this is a crane fly larva because it has the finger-like lobes on the one end of it. And they are one of the larger macroinvertebrates that we find typically. It's pretty plump and it's one of the first ones that jumps out when we are sorting. This macroinvertebrate belongs to the partially tolerant to pollution group, or the fair water quality. Here is our key to water quality assessment using macroinvertebrates again, and I just wanted to point out all the different bugs that we found today. So from group 3, we found the black fly larva. From group 2, we found the aquatic worm and the crane fly larva. And from the intolerant to pollution group, we found the mayfly nymph. I had mentioned earlier that when you find a diversity from all different groups, that's a good sign. So there's typically an equation that goes with this, but since we're doing the fast version of this today, I just want you to know that finding them from all different groups is a great sign and that we have pretty good water quality in Willow Creek.
Alrighty, so now the last most important piece is that we return these macroinvertebrates back to Willow Creek, which is where they originally came from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 2 buckets here and I'm going to go ahead and return them back to Willow Creek.